It's the early 80s, and there's like a dozen computer and video game systems out there. And in a perfect world, your company, if you want to make games, could release the same game for all of those different systems. You make it for one, then you convert it to others. You could use the same artwork and the same packaging and the same instruction manuals, and even put out 2 or 3 games for different systems on the same physical media. You save money, you make things buy or try compatible, and you've covered all your bases. In a perfect world, that would give you a chance to exploit the best features of each system and add its unique stamp to the game you already created. But in some cases, it was very much not a perfect world. And that is how we find ourselves in the Cosmi Conundrum.
Cosmi was never known for high-quality, genre-defining games. A few of their Commodore 64 titles, like Super Huey and Beyond the Forbidden Forest, made a few waves. But for the most part, their software was on the cheap wall at the department store, alongside companies like ShareData and Load and Go. They ended their life as a company producing shovelware, those cheap CD-ROMs from the turn of the millennium with like 500 solitaire games or an out-of-date bunch of word processors and utility programs. Cosmi's flirtation with the TI-99 4A yielded 3 games: Slinky, Spider Invasion, and Aztec Challenge. All 3 were released in packages with other versions of the same game for the Commodore VIC-20 or the Atari computer line. Slinky and Spider Invasion are in TI Basic, while Aztec Challenge uses the sprite graphics of Extended Basic. Slinky is clearly aiming for a Q*bert vibe, and on the VIC-20 version, your Slinky is pursued by bad guys who mimic the Slinky movement and clear the squares you've just landed on. Poor Richard Harrison was handed this game idea and told to make it happen in unexpanded TI Basic, a language too slow for arcade games, and he did the best he could with the source material. This is one of those cases where the game is more or less unplayable. It's an interesting historical curiosity and fun to look at, and there are plenty of elements to admire in Harrison's attempt. But as far as arcade fun goes, this is right up there with cleaning hair from a drain trap. If you dropped 10 or 15 or 20 bucks at the store on this, you'd have been pissed. Harrison does draw a nice playfield for us, and the animation of the moving Slinky actually looks cooler than the VIC version. Each new cube you land on gets a square on it, and when you put squares on every cube, you beat the level. There are 3 pre-existing squares, and if you land on those, you're teleported somewhere else on the board. Instead of trying to keep track of bad guys and slowing the turn loop down even more, Slinky just occasionally drops a ball from the ceiling. If it hits you, you lose a life. If it doesn't, it can do one of several things, including exploding and creating a hole in the playfield, or helping you by adding a bright square to a cube. It can even start chasing you around the board, in which case you're supposed to try to make it fall off the edge or go into a hole a previous ball created. If the ball hits one of your teleportation squares, you lose a life. Starting on level 2, if you backtrack over a cube you've already been on, the square you left there disappears, leading to all kinds of backtracking. At this point in the game, it starts to actually develop a strategic element as the balls come down with greater frequency and you start getting areas blown up on the playfield that make it difficult to get to every empty square. In fact, I'm fairly sure the longer you play on a level, the more likely it is that it becomes impossible to clear. And frankly, I'm not sure if that's by design or just because nobody assumed you'd actually play the game this long. There are some good ideas here, and this is probably the best Q*bert type game you could make happen in TI Basic. But that doesn't make it fun. Spider Invasion makes Slinky look like a Porsche as far as handling goes. You're supposed to be clearing 3 rooms of deadly spiders and their webs. Black spiders hatch from eggs, which you can shoot ahead of time, and white spiders seem to come from holes, which you can kind of partially shoot by accident, but which doesn't stop them from spawning these faster and more ferocious baddies. The spiders and webs look great because Harrison designed them all out of 4 tiles, not just 1. He's got 32 by 32 pixels instead of 8 by 8. They look like big sprites in an extended basic game. But as we quickly learn, this is still plain old basic. And moving these big characters around the board takes a slow game and makes it unbearable. You can only shoot up or down, which could be a strategic element, but in the midst of what feels like moving in molasses, it just makes you want to punch your monitor. The absolute war crime that makes this game complete torture is the drawing of the screen after you lose each life. It lays out how many obstacles remain in each of the 3 rooms and takes up to a full minute to display, then it just clears the board and redraws the playfield. It would be a decent graphical touch if it happened in a second or 2, but as it is an unbelievable waste of time. I cannot imagine how this so-called feature made it past 1 round of playtesting. The people who have tried to make arcade games in BASIC tended to stick to single 8x8 pixel character graphics for economy of movement and to ratchet up the speed of the turn loop to at least an acceptable level by 1982 standards. But there is no such consideration here. I'm not convinced anyone played this game at all before releasing it. It is a total dog. I'm glad it's here and archived in the collection and all that, but I haven't cleared level 1 yet, and I have no intention of ever doing so. This is just awful. Aztec Challenge absolutely broke my heart when I first played it on the TI. The Commodore 64 version, itself a significant upgrade from the 1982 original, features one of the coolest 8-bit theme songs I've ever heard, plus a 3D opening stage that manages to cram so much atmosphere and tension into a pretty primitive presentation. It was a big hit with us as kids, and I was really hoping for something similar on the 99 4A. What we got instead is a black and white stick figure jumping on a series of platforms, with a mountain being redrawn every pass across the screen to simulate traveling toward your goal. It's actually a little engrossing once you get over the initial disappointment, and the sprite recognition and collision detection are pretty good. After my slog through Spider Invasion, this feels like Grand Theft Auto, honestly. But there's no denying, it's about as primitive as an action game can get. There are 5 levels, and I've made it to the 2nd one. According to the manual, I'm missing out on a level of scorpions and 2 levels of dodging spears from various directions, but I'm just not that compelled to see the rest. If you do beat all 5 levels, the game starts over with different color schemes to indicate the onset of nightfall and make the timing of your jumps that much harder. So after all this, have we just determined that Cosmi was making shovelware the whole time? Or do we think this was genuinely the best efforts of a team of people trying to make something good? Some people would insist that it's unfair and not productive to criticize games like this, while others would wonder why we're bothering to archive them at all, much less dig them out of obscurity and spotlight them 40 years later. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I get something out of checking out all this old software, even when it's terrible. And make no mistake, these are not good games. I'm fascinated by the whole sweep of retro computing history, and if nothing else, seeing games like this makes me appreciate the developers who managed to do more than this, who found better ways to get around the limitations of the system. Or better yet, wrote for what they knew it could do, instead of trying to make it be something it couldn't be. And I'm always fascinated by the little touches, like the way the Slinky is animated. These little flourishes that make a terrible game that much closer to something that could have been presentable. So raise a glass to Slinky and Aztec Challenge and well, maybe not Spider Invasion. Whether you were shovelware on a deadline or someone's disaster of a passion project, you're safe here now, on the shelf, in the archives of the War Room.